The speakers, first three speakers, 10 minutes each, thereabouts. Short, sharp. Who's admitting? Is it the technical?
You're live now.
So we are live.
Okay, I could say good morning, good afternoon, good evening around the world. It's Barbara Norman. I'm Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Canberra in Australia. And it's my great pleasure to be chairing this first half of this session. And my co-collaborator, Rudana, is chairing the second half of the session. And welcome to the Integrated Holistic Approach to Planning and Collaborative Governance for More Climate Resilient Cities. Quite a long title, but very important words there for sure. So we're all delighted to be here, and may I welcome particularly the participants for this session. You'll see on this slide, this session is being hosted by Planners for Climate Action. And after today, I really encourage you to go and have a look on the World Wide Web for Planners for Climate Action. It's an active collaboration, international collaboration in this space. So I won't go through all the bios at this point because that might take up half the session. So I'll just quickly recognise and welcome Lindsay Bremner, University of Westminster. Welcome Victoria Lawson, who I hope has joined us, or if not yet, will soon, from the London Borough of Hounslow. Shia Lhasa from Uganda, very warm welcome. Francesco Musco from Venice. I'm not sure what IUAV stands for, but very welcome from that university. Myself from Australia, Philip Rode from LAC, London School of Economics in London, and Giulio Verdini from University of Westminster. So you can see just there, quite an international collaboration. I think if you could stop sharing, or maybe someone could, can I stop sharing that? No, I can't.
No, I have, it's my lecture behind Barbara.
Oh, okay, so it's the first slide. Very, very, very good. So in this session, we're going to have three short, sharp presentations, excellent ones, case studies for 10 minutes each or thereabouts. And then that will be followed by a panel discussion. And so the whole session takes about 1.5 hours. So let's begin, I think. Rudana, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara, very much, and welcome everyone on board. So I'm going to present an integrated holistic approach to planning and collaborative governance for more climate resilient cities, particularly some experiences from our London work. We focus at the University of Westminster on cases from London, and that's why we are now curating it as the London Lab. So my starting point for this discussion is that we know that climate change impacts and risks have become threatening in many regions to the sustainability and resilience of communities, to natural areas, biodiversity and resources. And climate change mitigation and adaptations have often been seen as costly measures and or difficulties or a burden. However, I would argue that climate mitigation and adaptation can turn into drivers for innovation and shared benefit in cities. They can become part of how we create new opportunities for urban areas and more resilient places. So this is based on my background, my PhD in planning, in urban regeneration and harborfront planning and management from Denmark, on my ongoing climate research and article on the role of the private sector in sustainable urban development and closing climate gaps. And this article aimed to understand the contribution of the private sector to closing the climate gaps, exploring policy, governance, regulatory frameworks for the involvement of the private sector in urban development sustainability and climate efforts in 2 European cities. I looked into London and Copenhagen. And it's based on my practical professional experience and my teaching with a focus on sustainability, climate change, strategic planning, and dynamic cities. So my earlier research so far highlighted the following challenges. We have challenges related to current planning approaches. There is lack of holistic visions. There are challenges and differences in city practices related to governance and regulatory frameworks generally, and in London, the challenge is very great due to its governance forms. There are significant gaps in our knowledge about the exact role that public and private actors and communities play and can play in managing climate change, although we focus all the time, even in UN debates and other major organizations, on the role of the private sector and the participatory, the governance role, including public, private, and communities. So we need as well methods for defining these rules. There is a knowledge gap around the implications of climate change for the different sectors. And there are challenges related to current patterns of involvement of private and public actors in urban regeneration generally, leading many times to disconnected cities and wasted opportunities, unfortunately. So my research highlights the importance of the following. It's really important to promote integrated approaches and integrating sector goals in urban areas and across different scales. And this integration is really crucial at all stages of design, of plan, of construction, implementation, and management. Secondly, it is important to increase collaboration, but based on clear understanding of the different contributions. And thirdly, it is important to expand these approaches from simple adaptations to include holistic planning approaches comprising urban areas. Area-based approaches aiming at strengthening localities and places and including climate measures are really useful. So it's really important to adopt these area-based approaches. The importance of strengthening circular approaches and promoting new behaviors of organizations. It's very important as well to update our regulatory frameworks and to look for establishing data and including smart approaches to manage and monitor lifetime impacts in the built mass and the urban areas generally. We don't have enough data to assess these impacts. City leadership has been developed as a notion in my article, and I'm building on that as a new notion where cities can really work to ensure synergies between actors and monitor impacts and implementation across different instances. So here, through my teaching activities, I have worked on the following. I'm looking at different areas along the Thames River, especially because the ecological role of the river and its importance and implications for climate resilience in London. So I'm looking at Brentford with my students under the theme Zero Carbon Neighborhood, and also with the MA students under the theme 15-Minute City. I have looked at Deptford with the MA students in relation to the theme ecological placemaking. And I'm looking now on Deptford, looking at the theme climate resilient city. I'm also working on Midway Sustainable and Resilient Council. All of these works are in collaboration with colleagues at the university that I will name now. So starting with Deptford to show you what we have done, this is an example of students' projects where we focused on Deptford as a city of places. We wanted to promote ecological placemaking as an example for London to promote into a city of places. And when we say ecological placemaking, it is really to use all the ecological potentials in Deptford to bridge the gaps between new regeneration projects and the existing community, using the potentials in the public realm, improving mobility patterns to strengthen sustainable mobility forms, and strengthening the high street, creating wetland areas, working with decentralized energy generation, using the power of the water, and enhancing sustainable mobility, as I mentioned, creating a movement around ecology in the neighborhoods, and creating a movement around the culture of co-making, building on the circular economy, growing, building on the urban farming, and this greening and urban and blue-green infrastructure, and strengthening the digital realm, promoting eco-learning, and strengthening ecological culture, historical significance of the neighborhood, safety, community sharing, and also including nighttime economy. These are examples of projects where the students worked on the identity of the neighborhood, and it seems really that it is possible to promote these qualities. We worked in collaboration with Deptford communities at the occasion of their neighborhood plan, and we were happy to be mentioned there. So the work also involved that the students should develop an implementation plan and look for suitable funding, looking at all sorts of funding from all sources, from public sector or from other crowdfunding, to ensure possibilities of implementations. And this ended by an exhibition under London Festival of Architecture, where we advocated that we can really, through this integrated approach, promote the interest of ecology and the interest of the community, which we created as from boundaries to potential. So this was a work I worked on this module with my colleagues, Bill Erickson and Dr. Cristalia Campesino. The other project we focused on with the students, with the MA students and the BA students, was Brentford. And here we were lucky to work in collaboration with the Hounslow, London Borough of Hounslow, who are on board with us. So with this, the students of the MA module, Dynamic City, a module which I led in collaboration with my colleague Bill Erickson, we focused here on promoting the opportunities by the canals and recreating an identity for the neighborhood as for this district as both aware neighborhood working towards a 15-minute place. And we created it as a place, 15-minute place, and not 15-minute city, because we wanted the town to develop both as self-sufficient, not the district as self-sufficient, but also as a location at the intersection of different flows interacting with the world outside. So here the students also introduced ecology as a major element, looking at blue-green infrastructure, connectivity, projects, entrepreneurial projects, social hubs, looked at the high street health and connectivity. So here also you can see that the projects that the students went very in details to look at the possibilities to include climate adaptation measures, using them as asset for public realm and for social interaction, and creating a movement around the town and the co-growing together, and the social hubs and ecological learning. In the project Brentford, the Zero Carbon Neighborhood, which I which I led this module with my colleague Robin Crompton, we worked towards promoting Brentford as a zero carbon neighborhood. This was also in collaboration with Hounslow Borough. We are very thankful. And here we can see that the objectives that the students focused on different sorts of projects, all together promoting the zero carbon neighborhood by, for example, reinforcing sustainable mobility forms, increasing connectivity and green links, using the power of the energy from the canals, and creating and based on the farming, urban farming principles. So it was really a very good project where the students also dared to propose solutions like community energy forms, for example, and look for funding and enablers. So these were really fascinating projects where we can see that public realm quality was addressed, active travel, safe travel, connectivity, community engagement in innovation, circular economy, cycling, heritage routes, tourism, community projects, and community and school education around ecology, the pop-ups, the jobs, all of it based on also promoting a spirit of entrepreneurialism. So we could notice that we miss still the retrofitting of buildings, which we would like to build in our discussions. So finally, to come to the conclusions, there is a great opportunity to address climate gaps through an integrated approach to planning and governance while benefiting communities. But more evidence-based approach should be developed. We need to see how much we can evidence this. It's important to clarify potential opportunities to address climate resilience in urban areas through an area-based approach. And more in-depth understanding of climate gaps is needed. Further, we need indicators to assess performance and impacts and smart tools to monitor complex impacts in urban interventions. Challenges including financial to implementation and scaling up across boundaries. There are these challenges and we need to establish proper and adaptable data records acknowledged at the city and national levels. We felt that these are really very good aims to address, but we need to have evidence and data. And we need to, most of all, we find that it is really good to have these holistic pilot examples, and we wish they can be reinforced in practice because they can showcase the benefit and prompt a bottom-up change of policy and planning approaches. So, that is coming to the end of my presentation, and I'm really keen to hear what you think. Yeah, looking at scales and possibilities and realism, having it with eyes of realism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rudana, and excellent presentation, and lots to reflect on and think about for our panel discussion coming up soon after our speakers. Now we're just waiting for another speaker. So I've asked Julio to go next. And Julio, are you there? Are you ready?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Barbara. I'm gonna
Great. And if you'd like to share your slides while I quickly introduce you. So Julio is, I've got here, where are you? Oh, there we are. Is a reader at the University of Westminster, course leader, and in the Bachelor of Arts, is it? Designing cities, anyway. So clearly very well equipped to present on his research on climate resilience post-pandemic cities. So thank you very much, Julio.
Thanks, Barbara, and thanks also, Rudana, for organizing the sessions, for inviting me. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to show some reflection based on a project that we implemented in the last couple of years, but particularly in the last month, I would say. So there are still a bit ongoing, if you like. And I would like to introduce basically the question of communities in our reflection on holistic approaches to planning and governance model for climate resilient cities, particularly based on the case study of East London, where we did some work with mapping and then engaging with some local communities along the river quite recently.
So do we have your presentation? I've got conclusions and reflections up here right now.
Sorry, can you see the first slide?
No.
Oh, sorry.
We can see. Have you stopped sharing, Rudana?
No, I'm trying to stop it now, actually. So,
okay. I need to, that's the reason.
So we just need to get rid of one talk and we'll get the next one, please. So just
I'm trying, but I cannot find it anymore.
It's on top, the red button. Yeah, stop sharing.
Or shrink. Oh gosh.
So is there a technical?
Normally you can find this in the top of your screen, where is a button, stop sharing.
Yeah, we can, but I'm unable to. It went to a thumbnail, the whole video. I cannot access again.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it is all just, I see it on the size of 1 centimeter by 4 centimeter, everything.
So is our technical person here, please?
Maybe if you click on Ask Dana first, and then you click on.
Here we are.
Yeah, here we are. Yeah.
Got it?
Thank you. Thank you for being our technical person.
Is it good?
Yes, thank you for helping us.
Okay, welcome.
That's why you're there. Excellent. All right, as we're being recorded, we should continue on, I think. Okay, so welcome, Julio, and look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So can you see now my first slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So I won't do the introduction again. I'll go straight to the presentation. So we call it the East London Lab, and it was started as a project funded by the University of Westminster, a community fund, seed fund for research on city climate pedagogy and practice, which, by the way, the overall project will be presented in a dedicated session next Thursday here in the conference. So I also invite to attend that if you're interested on climate justice. But I will focus now on the specific case study of London. So it's quite specific here. And the main aim, let's say, of our interest was to explore both vulnerabilities in terms of human, non-human, so social and environmental, in relationship to the problems of climate change and governance, of course. And then to try and promoting transdisciplinary research by involving activists, practitioners, local communities in a number of projects. A studio, a climate urbanism studio, a project that we did with students on producing a video and interviewing those communities that was presented in the meeting in Milan last couple of weeks ago, all for climate in preparation of COP26, and then some further research reports which are now being done by also our students. And we also publish, is forthcoming, is not yet published, a paper on that called Climate Urbanism in the Post-Pandemic World, Mapping Vulnerability and Exploring Community Activism in East London, with my colleague Corinna Dean. Is forthcoming in a book by Springer on designing for vulnerable communities. Now, the main point I would like to make is in this exercise of mapping vulnerabilities, we look at the role of communities in this process, and also against the backdrop of issues of planning, but also institutional barriers in implementing a project of a park, the Riverlea Park. And so looking also at the history of this project, which can reveal quite a lot of information, I hope, for our discussion. And of course, nowadays that we are still in the pandemic, I have to say, but somehow hoping to get out soon, reflecting on the post-pandemic neighborhood and how this consideration can be taken on board. This is the project I mentioned, the video that our students did and presented for climate, and it was a great exercise actually for getting those people, the local community, involved to let them feel, say in a way, even the importance of what they are doing, and to bring that to a different stage. And actually, the result of the video and the links and so on were shared among their social network, which has quite a large outreach in East London. So in that case, it's quite interesting how they can sort of multiply the message of the project, if you like. Now, in terms of mapping vulnerabilities, I started by saying that you can see here that the area that is of our interest along the Riverlea in East London is the area where there's highest concentration of deprivation in the city of London, is the red areas. And similarly, this area is also the one which is more prone to risks in general. Flooding risk, which are currently, of course, all the area is benefiting from flood defense, from the barriers of the Thames, but this might also change in the future due to rising sea level and so on. So this is still an area to be, how to say, observed carefully. But besides that, the area is being located in East London with its industrial history is an area that has went through lots of pressure from industrialization, of course, legacy of pollution, which is still there, and the river is highly polluted. And as you can see in the picture, the banks have been highly engineered, so in a way reducing the natural elements along the river. And then this area has been object of strong development pressure because, of course, East London, all the prime location along the River Thames have been redeveloped in the past, and then the Olympic Games in the north have been added another layer of development. In some cases, of course, producing more open space and green space. It's successful from that point of view, but also pushing gentrification even further, and also leaving some areas quite ill-equipped with green space and open space, especially in the south part of the Ree Valley. An article in The Guardian that says the river that London forgot. It's quite interesting because it says the story of a river that was, in a way, the backyard of different neighbors. That's the way it has been described. And being the backyard of neighbors, so actually the river is the boundary between Tower Hamlets and Newham, and possibly north, and is also crossing Hackney in the north. It means that it has not been of central interest for those boroughs, but instead it has been marginalized. And this has been the reason why, when more than 10 years ago, there was the proposal of creating a park, the River Lee Framework Park, north to south, that was in conjunction with the project of the redevelopment project of the Olympic Games. This was initially well received locally, but that was never really fully implemented. So it was proposed in 2007. There was advocacy for finally sort of a remediation of the legacy of this industrial development. But then with the economic crisis 28 and 9, there was not really funding for implementing the park as it was in the plan. Ironically, that was actually even in the Abercrombie plan a long time ago. So it somehow it's been around for a while, but for a number of reasons. So lack of funding for the crisis, the following austerity measure, the fact that this is a sort of not of essential interest for boroughs, this was never really implemented. So the situation today, just to jump on the current situation, is that along the river there has been a series of initiatives, and this is where our interest started to rise, about local communities tending to sort of process of reappropriation of some of these areas, while some others that were initially designated as parks are in a process of transformation into housing development due to this sort of uncoordinated process of development, which is taking place in this liminal and sort of area of boundary. So I will just briefly mention the case of Cody Dock, which I think is the most interesting probably, and is exactly after the economic crisis, when the prices of land were lower and there was not particular interest for further development around 10 years ago, that a social entrepreneur is quite active, which you have seen probably in the picture that I put up there. He was one of our interviewees. He was the one who initiated this project of reusing this old dock, and then around that building a real community project by getting by getting the interest of the local community, by doing a series of work in terms of restoring the river banks and then reusing the space, and also mobilizing lots of volunteers for, as you can see in the picture, for instance, replanting trees. So doing quite a lot of activities. Other cases like the Leaven Road Gasworks was, as I said, originally designated as park, and instead now is under development for housing and other activities. Now, the final layer I want to add is that during the pandemic, there has been a real rediscovery of this area, of especially the south part of the River Lee, due to the fact that, of course, people were in lockdown and they started to revalue, in a way, the open space and these spaces around the river that were probably considered marginal or not, how to say, even safe from a certain point of view. And in Cody Dock, they experienced a real boom of visitors coming through down the river and then starting to use the area, if you like. And so that tells the fact that even in this sort of uncoordinated way of development, there are experiences which are now getting important, if you like, for the community, for the local communities. Now, just to sort of draw some conclusion of this case study, some of the learning, I would say, that the River Park, it can be seen potentially as a sort of climate resilient project for a number of reasons, for potential future flooding adaptation. Some areas can play as a buffer zone, for rewilding the river banks, for greening and mitigation, so for both adaptation and mitigation, if you like. However, the history of this project, as many other projects, I mean, they are actually experiencing institutional barriers in implementation. So this lack of horizontal collaboration due to budget restrictions in a way, while on the other hand, a lot of sort of popping up of activities, punctual activities to reclaim the river for community purposes without a real coordination, towards a common vision, I would argue. The pandemic situation has instead meant to rediscover this area as a space for community. Lots of people, I think thousands of people actually are involved as volunteers in this project, so it's quite astonishing. However, the risk that we are facing nowadays is that the area is, as you remember from the map that I show, is an area of inequality, if you like, and the pandemic is maybe rising even further this inequality. There's a persisting lack of coordination across boroughs for implementing the project, and also possibly the revalue in these areas without the sort of equity-oriented policy. It might also mean further green gentrification. So we need to be sure that this won't happen. Otherwise, what the community have built in the recent past might turn to be dangerous for them as well, or at least for the wider community in the area. And so reflecting for this panel, and I hope these 3 points might bring some inspiration for the discussion later, it's important to look at the institutional history of places that is also often entangled with the problems of inequality, pollution, deprivation, so the overall vulnerability. There is a narrow margin now for green recovery in addressing those problems, like in a sort of meaningful way, and looking at equality as a whole and climate resiliency. And finally, and this is my last point, is that I think there is also the need to reinstate quite a strong role of university in bridging and act as medium between communities, which sometimes they act actually against, or let's say not fully coordinated with local authorities to push the climate agenda forward. So advocacy, ethical actions, consensus buildings, when actually this possibility of collaboration cannot happen for historic or for local reason. So we might also act towards that direction. And that's the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thanks, Giulio. And great, thoughtful conclusions there. Very interesting case study. I certainly have some questions, but I'll leave that for later. Now, my question, importantly now, is our third speaker here yet. Rudana, are you there by any chance?
Yes, I'm here. Just we need Victoria. Is she present?
No, she doesn't seem to be. So I think what we might do, I'll finish chairing this soon. And but because we have a, sorry?
They were very keen to attend from the borough, and they are our collaborators
yes,
in the project.
So if you want to work directly with the technical person behind the scenes to see if that can be resolved, that would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what
in the meantime, as this is being recorded, we'll I might see if anyone's got any questions of either, well, Rudana, you might be a bit busy right now, but Giulio, any questions of Giulio? Before we move on to the next session in a few minutes. Anybody?
Let me come in here. So it's Philip. Can I, Barbara, would that be fine?
Yes, please.
Good. So, Julia, it's really interesting to hear about the case of the River Lee, and in your analysis, I wondered what worked. What were the success stories over the last 10 to 15 years where you say the planners got it right? They were maybe also including the community, and there are sort of positive lessons to be learned.
I think that the project started with good intentions. So there was actually funds allocated for together with the project of the large event of the Olympic Games, funds allocated for using that event to reshape the entire area towards a sort of post-industrial, for a post-industrial, more kind of sustainable future. So actually there were projects for really implementing pockets of green along the river to reclaim an area that was actually treated not well historically. That fund was then scrapped for budget issues, as I said earlier. So in reality, then could not be implemented. And so I think here, in a way, the lesson is that most of climate resilient project needs actually a sort of need to be steered to a certain extent, so that boroughs can cooperate towards something that with a big incentive, because otherwise they won't have that sort of willingness or incentive to do so. And so the result is that, but in any case, the importance of a project like that was to create a culture and among the communities, among the local planners of the park. So in reality, the park was not fully implemented, but was partially implemented. So even in absence of funding, in a way, some areas were realized. Because I mean, images started to become spread, to circulate. It's really creating a culture, and communities could, in a way, jump into that and becoming sort of with their sense of belonging to reappropriate of some of these spaces. So I think this is the learning, the main learning that I would like to draw. Then, of course, now we are in a situation that how to move forward, because this seems to be still quite scattered and uncoordinated, and the pandemic and the funding for the green recovery should be used to probably reconsider some of this project. That's the kind of probably message I would think it's important to write.
Yeah.
Barbara, can I come in with a question at this point?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Rodena and Giulio, for really great presentations, and I look forward to the discussion. However, Giulio, I just have one question for you. I mean, your final concluding point about the university as being a mediator, which I find really interesting. But what you seem to be advocating for is the university as a sort of NGO kind of role in this particular instance. And I'd just like you to speak a little more about what you mean by the university, because that's a very abstract concept. What university, who at the university, and so on.
Thanks, Lindsay. Now, actually, the topic of the session that I will chair on Thursday is really about the role of university in the process of creating sort of bridges between communities and the society, in a way. So it's in a way it starts from a sort of criticism of the fact that universities have been often driven by in recent years or decades narrow interest, if you like, for a number of reasons, for budgetary constraints and so on. While there is quite a possibility for universities in somehow creating spaces for common goods, if you like, because they are not working with profits in a way. So to rise that sort of awareness, to bridge the gap between what would be sort of NGO or even private sector in a way, and the society as a whole. So in that sense, I think that there is a possibility to reintroduce a role for that. Now, in the project we presented for All for Climate, we involved 12 universities across the world, showing how they work with local communities on facing issues of climate change. And it's really beautiful, if you like, to see how many different projects have been implemented from working in New Zealand with the Maori communities and affected by rising sea level, to Mexico, where there's works done for empowering people in an area near the city center for self-construction and fighting pollution. So I think there is quite an interesting space, in a way, for scholars, in a way, to be engaged and also to produce research that then can be sort of shared and published. So that's the kind of advocacy I would think is important to make, and the reaction from many colleagues across the world has been quite interesting.
That sounds really Good, Julia. If I can comment, I mean, it is the same projects here we are working on. That the projects I presented, they are a sort of advocacy where we worked with the communities and with the local authority, whom we are missing now, Victoria Lawson, because she was going to speak about the green recovery, actually, and challenges to the implementation of the green recovery in Hounslow, which we thought would have been really useful to the discussion from the perspective of local authorities.
For
So I don't know why they were not able to join finally, but yeah.
Don't worry, we can adapt and we can finish this session, this part successfully. And then if she joins us, maybe we can give her some more time.
Of course, we can get further.
Intake.
So
okay. So just before did you want to say something more in this session, Rodana?
No, just I wanted to ask if there are any questions to my presentation, which was based on actually the proposals were all based on in-depth analysis by the students of context. So that would be really interesting to hear.
Absolutely. Any questions, please?
Let me go again. So you mentioned that the holistic visions are missing. Now, if people from outside, certainly sort of the European context with the tradition in strategic planning would listen to that, they would say, but hold on, you have these wonderful instruments, the London Plan, you have a London Climate Action Plan. I mean, you're full of visions, and you have a directly elected mayor with a manifesto. So if we state something like there is a lack of a vision, what do you actually mean by that? And also, are you thinking of a comparison? Are you thinking of cities or local governments where this is actually much clearer and has been serviced to a far greater level of satisfaction? Or is it a more abstract critique which says, all our visions in any political context are all crap at this moment?
Yeah, can be. I mean, thank you very much, Philippe. I mean, it is actually a very good question because everyone says they have a vision and a holistic vision too. We have been discussing holistic visions for ages. But here, actually, it is a vision based on a new way of experimentation. Is not the traditional way of planning, which I mean. It's really a new movement around the local areas and the towns and the cities, where we test these entrepreneurial aspects, where we test community engagement, where we test circularity, where we test new ways of, creating a movement around the making, the doing together, the learning, the sharing, and the leadership, the governance. So it's rather a more dynamic way to see a holistic vision rather than the traditional way of seeing this is the plan and this is what you need to do. And here, which I find it's so important to experiment and explore. And here the complexity comes as well from the overwhelming amount of opportunities that we can actually sense embedded in the local areas, and that can contribute to mitigate and answer climate challenges, contributing to our health, well-being, and also overcoming deprivation. It's just simply we are not using these opportunities. We are not empowering, we are not using the dynamic in the society and the different, potentials and forces in the society in a new way. And that's why when I mean city leadership, I don't mean the older form where the city decides and imposes things from the top down. I just mean that the city as an enabler for all of these, for all of these movements to unfold collaborations between private sector and entrepreneurial young spirits, communities unfolding, public authorities having a new role in the communities. I am imagining something completely new. And this is also based on my observations, for example, in, let me say, in countries like Syria, which I happened to work in for some years, where I thought really, I mean, you do lots of plans, but nothing is happening. Because actually we don't need dead plans with land use. We need a new spirit, a new understanding of how we can move things on the ground. And this is only by mobilizing everything together. So this is what I mean. It's really, really difficult to put it in one example, but it's just this movement around things and the unlimited opportunities that can unfold if we explore the circularity of our, of our systems, if we explore the potentials in the human capital and people, and try to understand things in a better way.
Thank you, Rudena. Thank you very much. All right, we're actually on time and ready to move now to the panel. I've got a few things to say, but I'll keep my comments when I'm speaking in the second half.
Okay,
so
thank you.
I'll finish my role as chair, and thank you all for participating, particularly to our two terrific speakers, Rudena and Julio. And it's all been recorded, and so we'll have your presentations to be able to share later. So
thank you so much.
I'll now hand it over to you, Rudena. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for keeping the time. You do much better than I do because the time just flows with me. So thank you very much. Well, I mean, now we will come to the panel discussion. We have prominent speakers on board, and I would like to start with discussing the obstacles in relation to, to the question of scale. Looking at all of these challenges, for example, that Julio referred to, vulnerability in the locality, for example, and the opportunities that I referred to, the unlimited opportunities. So what would be the obstacles in relation to thinking climate adaptation mitigation on this broad scale, if we want to take it in both in negative or in a challenging way, but also in the positive way? So how can we make more of the good, but how can we also overcome vulnerability when we think large scale? So can I address the question to first to Philippe, because you are interested in the great urban and regional scales, and then to Lindsay, please.
Thank you. So I thought, it's interesting that you thought, the scale in geography terms is where you felt, I should speak. And it's true, I do feel very passionate about maybe the metropolitan level. But I then thought that the real issue is actually a different scale, and it's time scale. And it's the urgency. And that relates to recent work which we are doing around this issue of new institutional arrangements, maybe also new forms of democracy that allow for and enable far more radical and rapid change and intervention. And that then leads to a whole range of different issues which indirectly already came up in both of your talks. We all share this frustration around there are good ideas, there are solutions. We have been discussing many of the features, the baseline features for more than a decade, two, even some colleagues, 3 decades. What we now know is we have this decade where this stuff needs to happen at a much, much more rapid pace than ever before. And yet at the same time, we have seen some radicality of intervention during the pandemic. And if you just take how much upheaval the low traffic neighborhoods in London and in the UK have created, it gives you a little bit of flavor what one is up against. And, by comparison, what's required, putting up bollards in our neighborhoods to ensure that people walk and cycle more and that there's less traffic circulating, that's just absolute peanuts by comparison to the behavior change and then also, the physical, socio-spatial change that is required. And that then brings me to the terminologies also Rudena again re-emphasized around integration, coordination, those mechanisms which can help. There's a lot of technocratic language in sort of the planning discourses. And I think it's constantly, or there's a constant importance to go back to those. But the real issue, the real tension is about the collective decision-making and how we can democratically legitimize, whether these are the ideas your students have, whether these are the ideas the IPCC has about radical carbon emission reduction, or indeed an idea of a local neighborhood plan. And it seems this is where we're currently failing, or where we certainly don't have the right type of solutions. So I think for my discussion, and I thought it was interesting for Giulio to bring in again the university as a sort of key stakeholder, but just use that idea and then let's think about how a university, which is also a very arrogant institution and which comes in with sort of elite behavior, and we have not done a particularly good job of really embracing, I guess, the fuller spectrum of society, also because we put up a lot of communicative boundaries, how we share our ideas. So how can an organization like a university really become part of sort of the new collective decision making for radical and rapid intervention? I think is something that interests me a lot. And the university would just be one tiny example of then a whole range of much broader institutional change that could and hopefully will enable the required pace. And I think through a time-sensitive perspective, one can then come back to geographic scale as well. But Rudaina, I think the manipulation of urban form in places like London at the macro scale maybe even needs to put on hold for now. We really need to think about a lot about our individual behaviors, the behaviors of our communities, how we use existing infrastructure, before we, create the next mega plan for the southeast of England with all sorts of new infrastructures, which at the moment we can only build in a very carbon intense way. So there's a real tension there as well. I'll leave it at this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is really very insightful. And I mean, the question of behavior and the question of scale and how we can mobilize things bottom up possibly will lead me then to a different question. Possibly I will ask the question instead of Lindsay now. I will keep Lindsay to a bit later because now you take me to another direction, Philip. I would like to raise the question to Shuaib. Shuaib, we have been in a discussion around, these processes and behavior and way of doing things. And actually you spoke about a completely different way of doing things, like in, for example, in Uganda, especially with the role of the communities there. So how would you approach this in terms of the behavioral aspect that Philip has been mentioning, and the how we can mobilize the bottom up instead of keeping possibly these organizations, dominating the decision?
Yeah, thank you, Rudaina, and thanks everyone for the wonderful discussion so far. Shuaib Rwasa from Uganda, as introduced earlier. We first of all, in the context of Uganda, and I would possibly speak broadly on Global South, particularly Africa, the experiences are slightly different in terms of the nature in which urban development has occurred. Many cities are already existing, but not all of them actually have been developed the way that we have traditionally rationalized planning. So here is the plan, and this is what you have to do, as Rudaina mentioned. What has happened is the development and growth of cities in an organic way, and that has created a lot of space within which individual, community, and other kind of entrepreneurial ingenuities have emerged around so many things that we've always thought can be developed in a particular way that is centralized and networked, which is really very carbon intensive, as has been mentioned by Philip. So what we have done in the Urban Action Lab at Makerere University, training planners, but in a very transdisciplinary manner, and bringing social scientists, sociologists, as well as geographers into the mix of the Urban Action Lab, is to test out a different way to make planning more holistic and appreciate and embrace the existing urban development in Kampala as largely as described emerging. Many people want to describe that as informal. We think the positive spin to that is harnessing the opportunities in there. And we have taken this approach where beyond human resources of the city or part of the city fabric, cultural aspects of that, as well as the gray that dominates. We now have to add in the blue and the green elements of the city, which then makes us evaluate and scan what are the climate risks or other disasters that define the profile of the neighborhood of the city, and then what are the challenges, but at the same time, what are the levers and what opportunities could be done from, opportunities could be harnessed from that. So in that, we have tested out the combination of the green, blue, culture, human, and gray elements of the city. And that has opened up a lot of space in terms of experimentation on hybrid and heterogeneous infrastructure on water and sanitation, urban agriculture with, market niche enterprises. We evaluated quite a number in Kampala, and this can happen in Kampala, maybe a different story in Ouagadougou, maybe a different story in Johannesburg. But what is important is the framework and the approach provides the opportunity to identify and scan the climate risk, identify the disaster profiles of the neighborhood, the city, and then opportunities, and then map the different solutions that could be implemented by the community. Now, going back to the point very quickly of individual ingenuities, that is where now the capabilities of communities, the capabilities of individuals, micro, small scale, and medium enterprises around these different traditional sectors of water, sanitation, and even transportation. Yesterday, we had a discussion about a different mode of transportation in Kampala. This is where the collaboration and governance becomes real in terms of testing and piloting. This is where you bring all these different people, and at the University, the Urban Action Lab, we've been more or less of a convener, bringing different stakeholders, ministries, city governments, communities, these small micro enterprise entrepreneurs, to really discuss what can be done to bring decency, to bring some kind of order that is not the order through the linear, rationalist planning that we've always been doing, but at the same time to improve in terms of coverage in these different elements of the city. So we do have some examples and some publication. I'll share a few of those, but just to quickly, go over the question you've asked, Rodina. Thank you. Back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. That sounds really interesting to have insights into this. Thank you very much. Well, we tried to look at, it looks like the context has a great significance in this case. So, different places have different traditions and ways of doing things. So that is really a great insight from Uganda. So if we try to look at another context, for example, looking at the Italian context, Francisco, are you around?
Sorry, Rudene, I was just chatting with Francesco that he cannot join, the same problem as Victoria.
Oh, that's really sad.
I was trying to advise how to do it, but he's not here.
Yeah, it's really sad. We could not get them. Okay, so maybe then we can come to discuss, because we have spoken about the context in this way. So we can possibly go to discuss this scale, benefiting from Lindsay's experience. So Lindsay, you have been working on institutional barriers possibly and scaling up in East Asian regions. So what insights can you give around the issue of scale, not in time perspective, but in geographical perspective this time? So are these experiences scalable, or how would these barriers or vulnerability appear when we talk about a big scale? Can they be managed through a bottom-up approach, or do we need something else actually?
Thanks, Rudena. Maybe I should just give a little bit of context to what I'm going to say. The context of my work has been a 5-year-long research project called Monsoon Assemblages, which has looked into the relationship between globalization and climate change in 3 cities in South Asia: Chennai in India, Dhaka in Bangladesh, and Yangon in Myanmar. So that's really the context of what I'm going to say now. And I mean, the first thing I want to say that was possibly missing from both Rodena and Giulio's presentations, and in fact, it's what my project focused on, was climate itself. And, you know, the question, what is climate? Whose climate? At what scale is climate operating? And therefore, at what scale do we have to think it and engage with it? Because I think very often we offer kind of quick solutions, and their solutions are many, but to what questions? And those questions are very often not clarified. So, you know, my project really looked at the monsoon as a climatic system that operates at multiple scales and multiple times. And so, and we started to draw on knowledge sources from both science and from real on-the-ground indigenous knowledge of climate and climate change. So really our project stepped back from providing solutions completely and really just focused on the question of what do we mean by climate? How does climate operate differently in different places? How does climate operate differently at different times? And we found, for instance, in Bangladesh, that the very building material of the city, brick, is a climatic material. You know, climate is woven into food, into building materials, into practices, into rituals, into lifestyles. And so the whole issue of seeing climate only as a threat is highly problematic. And so really the question became, how do you co-produce, and at what scale, okay, more resilient lifestyles with a volatile, changing, multi-scalar, multi-temporal system? And that question has never been tackled before. That's what the Anthropocene, that's what climate change is forcing us to work with, something that's unpredictable, undefined, and volatile. So therefore, and I'll stop quite soon, I would like to reiterate what Philip said, you know, the idea that this can be tackled through massive infrastructural, carbon-intensive infrastructure, through kind of keeping climate out through climate proofing, which we find a completely absurd idea. You know, we can't proof against the very system that gives us life, or we'd be dead. So, you know, like, how do we integrate our thinking of how to build resilient cities with climate becomes a far more productive question, I think. And to just conclude, for us, that really is working at the scale, at multiple scales, but particularly at the scale, at the small scale of kind of where one can understand climate in relation to people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Sounds really good. So your message is that flow with climate rather than fight it, almost.
Exactly, but knowing that it's both risky and life-giving. It's not a one-dimensional kind of something out there. It's the very, very substance of our lives.
Mm-hmm. But what about local communities, for example? I mean, if they are vulnerable, so how do you think aid would be to these communities? For example, can this be through advocacy alone, or through changing behavior, as Philip suggested, or as something else? Like, who should be responsible for, you know, ensuring the safety of these local communities?
Rodena, are you asking me that?
Yes.
I mean, I think that's something one has to co-produce with them. I mean, there's certain decisions that communities can't make on their own, but there's certain decisions which they certainly can and should be supported to do so. People have resilient habits, you know. People actually up to a certain point can you know, are able to adapt. And then at a certain point, they're no longer able to do that. And then I think, you know, that there has, I mean, I don't know who those authorities are. In my experience in Chennai, for instance, there is a certain point at which the state steps in and moves 500,000 people out of a floodplain, okay, in certain points, and that's a statewide action. Okay, at other kind of moments of the climatic cycle, people simply move all their goods from the ground floor up to the first floor. And, you know, they survive that summer, that monsoon season. So I think it varies with different events.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, this border between when we can think of a bottom-up approach and when, you know, a higher authority should step in. I think this line is really hard to define many times. Yeah, I mean, especially if we have changing like impacts of the climate. I know that we spoke about flowing with the climate, but it would be actually a bit difficult to define this line between bottom up and top down decisions, or let us not call it top down. Maybe somebody should, who has the knowledge, should also step in, or the financial possibilities and support. So it's not always leaving things, or laissez-faire, leaving everything down to the communities and leaving the responsibilities always with them, but engaging with them, as you are suggesting, everyone is suggesting. Barbara, would like, thank you so much, Lindsay, really, for the great insights. And Barbara, so how do you think, if Lindsay is suggesting, and it's open for Barbara and back to our participants, Philip, Julio, and Shrine. So if Lindsay is suggesting now we have to flow with climate and not fight climate, and really try to understand it rather than block it, that's really a very good understanding of the situation. So how can we share experiences across different, you know, regions? So what sort of experiences can we share and learn from in this case?
I think it's probably a good point for me to make my contribution here. So I think that certainly in the country I come from and the region, Australia and Oceania and Southeast Asia, that extreme events is nothing new for us. So, you know, very dramatic wildfires, floods, heat, drought has cost many lives in very recent years, and particularly the 2019-20 wildfires that led to devastation in our country, and we're still recovering. Coming to your question, who should be involved, how do we collaborate, what level of government, what partnerships, which really is behind this discussion. I think what we have learned, and I think support what Lindsay said, each situation does bring its own dimensions. However, it does help enormously, and we've had some very significant royal commissions here that keep coming to the same point that, yes, we must enable local engagement, and we can do that so much better now with smart technology, and especially in large countries like mine, with rural and remote communities. So that's a big plus, in fact. But we also must have national guidance as well, and national funding programs. It cannot be either or. Some of our most successful collaborations, in fact, have happened where local councils have worked together on a regional level, not mandated, but in a voluntary sense. And that's happened particularly in coastal planning, which happens to be my first expertise. And they have stood the test of time. The other thing I should mention, which would be remiss if it's not mentioned here today, is the increasing understanding and appreciation by land use planners, coastal planners, of the benefit of scenario planning. And that goes to the heart of dealing with risk and uncertainty in the future. As we inherited the British planning system here, and many nations did, it was based on the grounds of static land, and that doesn't work when the land's falling into the sea. And so there's huge millions of people are now at risk around the world, facing resettlement in the not too distant future, until the next 50 years or so. And you'll find those figures coming out from the UN agencies. So what's my point? It can actually work. And I'll just share very quickly 2 examples from my city. So I am a professor of urban and regional planning, so an academic. I was a practitioner, I was national president of the Planning Institute. So I tend to, that's my value added, bringing them together. But I also chaired the Climate Change Council here in the ACT in Canberra, and the inaugural chair, and I finished my term. But we had 2 visions. One was to be 100% renewable electricity by 2020. And it brought together the Australian National University, University of Canberra, which is the local one, which I belong to. I belong to both actually, and the government and communities. And we worked together on a common vision. And I don't think that's really been talked about much here, about a common vision that you can all work together towards. And we achieved that. We achieved that just before 2020. So we are 100% renewable electricity, which is pretty good achievement. Medium-sized city, 400,000 people. So my second point, I won't go through the other examples, but we are continuing on quite a successful pathway here. But my second point, coming to scale, is I think scale does matter. I've worked in large cities, and I've worked at the national level, I've worked at the provincial level, state level, but there is something, and I haven't nailed what it is yet, but there's something about small, medium-sized cities that does tend to help a lot in trying to progress these agendas. So less than 500,000 people. And I just share that because more than half the world's population lives in cities less than 1 million people. So it kind of matters. And I think that that's something worthy of discussion too. I could go on, but that's probably enough for discussion.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much. I mean, maybe it is shorter to the citizens when it is smaller or medium scale town. I mean, I happened to moderate once a panel between Greater London Authority Smart Cities, head of Smart Cities, and the head of Smart Cities in Austin, and the head of Smart Cities in Espoo, and they were looking at ecological, promoting the ecological values through the smart cities and sustainability. And it looked very clearly that, for example, in Austin, they had this focus on communities, and they could collaborate, they could involve the citizens and make things happen. But right. I mean, looking at London scale, I mean, how it was so difficult to think of a model of retrofitting, for example, of buildings and energy in buildings. If you look at the governance form and the number of inhabitants and the scale of the built environment, so it must have something the scaled, as you mentioned, in one way.
One approach. So Sydney, for example, so 5 million people, 6 million people. And New York did the same thing, was to look at the city not as a city, but to look at it as a series of villages and to break it down that way. So you can see the city in a different way that way. So anyway, I just want to say to Shuab, I've been to Kampala and went to a wonderful conference just near there on national heritage. It was fantastic.
Wow, that's nice.
Sounds really good. So coming back to Philip, because you mentioned the behavioral, and so would it be easier to change the behavioral in a smaller town than a larger scale town with regards to flowing with climate instead of fighting the climate, for example? So can we manage behavior better in a smaller scale town?
Yeah, let me come to this in a second, because I do think also what you just repeated Lindsay's argument about, how we treat the terminology climate. And I think this is such an important opportunity to remind ourselves that we have often shortened what actually is climate breakdown or climate change to just climate. And that's, of course, a complete unhelpful proxy term. Climate really what gives us the opportunity to live on this planet under current conditions, but clearly a climate breakdown is something which we need to avoid, and that's very hard to reframe as a positive term. So I think getting back to the specificity here is really quite helpful. I think in terms of the smaller places, and that can sort of relate it back to overcoming the juxtaposing of bottom up and top down. I think there's a central question of state institutions. We know that under emergency situations, and most scholars in more conventional emergency governance domains would say these are moments where the state is not an enabling state. The state is leading, as simple as that. There is just not the time to rely on sort of some bubbling up. You need to have a lot of executive powers being concentrated. Now, the problem is, of course, with long emergencies around, even COVID, but also climate, we are relying on, certainly in democratic societies, we are relying on behavior change by people. We can't have a chief police officer or fire brigade officer sort of like in an army giving commands and orders to those communities. It's not going to happen. And COVID was a really interesting lesson here. And I think we have seen interesting public leaders, mayors, that were much better making not sort of the hard, law and order announcement, but to really explain, to acknowledge how difficult the situation is, to acknowledge also one's own, the leader's own humanity and failings and, desperations. And through that kind of engagement, probably produced much better, quicker responses by the community. Now, you could advance the argument that this is possibly easier in smaller constituencies, where the relationship between maybe a mayor, maybe a local community chief, whatever that may be, where that can be facilitated more easily. But we should also not forget that what the bigger cities often bring together are communities of people that are often have been exposed in their own lifetime to a lot of change. Most people will have been moving around, at least at the country level, maybe even internationally. They have changed jobs. And it's in that context where sort of a degree of openness to behavior change and overcoming routines may also be quite present in very large sort of metropolitan, call them sort of more global environments, and which also sometimes helps the sort of places like London or Berlin, and indeed also many of the large global south cities in Mumbai and Delhi, to be part of a very sort of quick, dynamic response, which can compete to those responses in small towns and villages where communities have been developing over centuries, where everyone knows each other's last name and family. So I don't think it's an either or, but what we need to come back to is this idea of multi-level governance, the role of the state, and a clear understanding how much you devolve powers to, indeed, even down to the local community, certain to cities and regions, and where do you need to bring it back up to the national and supranational level. It's a collective action problem, and that really requires these multi-level state institutions to be heavily involved.
That sounds really very interesting discussion, actually. Yeah, so we are coming towards the notion collective action and collective planning, as you mentioned, Barbara, that we need this collective decision around our how to deal with climate threats and to flow with the climate as it is. So to come to a very good and precise terms. So coming to you, Giulio, because you work on with the project Decolonizing the Curriculum, especially the climate one. So how can we benefit from the learning in this session to inspire actions or to inspire a more localized curriculum?
Thanks, Rudena.
Thank you.
I would respond to that actually by allow me to make a bit of a small introduction about another aspect that we didn't touch, and I think it would be useful in this discussion about governance, because most of my research was based on China in the last years, and just really recently, in the last year and a half, being blocked in London and Europe, I decided to spend some time in East London, which I found very inspirational in a way. But we are here facing basically the problem of having the countries which are really those who are producing carbon emissions, the West, Europe, United States, and China, facing very different governance system. On one hand, you have China, which can implement quite effectively measures, let's say, to curb carbon emissions by providing incentives. And we have seen quite a lot of initiatives in that direction, and with quite an active involvement of policymakers in that, because they have political incentives to achieve that. And then instead, on the other hand, we have a situation that we need to face, which requires this strong collective action, this strong movement from the bottom, if you like. And we are seeing a lot of engaged mayors in trying to achieve that. So it is a much more fragmented situation, but it's a situation which is also very sort of moving quickly in a way. And here, to mobilize these energies, in a way, as we cannot, and we shouldn't probably, follow the model of China in that sense. I'm always asked when I speak, especially in Africa, in Morocco, how can we import the Chinese model? I say, well, I wouldn't import particularly that. I would see some benefit of that, but then it's really about working with the possibility of mobilizing local resources and community. So, and this goes in your question about the localities. Mm-hmm. So I think here there's really the role of many different actors that should play towards goals. As I said before, the role of university is essential, and we can't sort of ignore that. And then we are also in a situation where there are funding available in the green recovery that could help finally steering the process towards some more beneficial outcomes. So this is a small window of opportunity where we can further mobilize these local resources. It's the only way we in the West can do that, as we cannot really, and we won't really implement other models. So we'll see how it will go in the next months.
Yeah, thank you very much, Giulio. That sounds really, I'm excited as well to see the outcomes. So that's really good. Thank you. So coming to Shuaib, what are, now you have been working in Uganda, and you are working in the Global Resilience Center. So how do you think, because now you have the global vision and the very local vision, so how do you think the experience from Uganda can inspire other experiences?
Yeah, thank you once again. I think working at these two different levels has been very informative and inspiring on identifying and getting to think through what could possibly be done and what the limits are. What I've noticed is that there is seems to be a lot of thought and planning at much higher supranational level, that certain things can be done in a way that is more or less universal in quotes, of course, in the sense that you can transfer, ideas and, options. Some people want to call them solutions or technologies from one place to the other. But working on the local scale does make me appreciate the value of the context and being able to harness the capabilities and the resourcefulness in that particular locality. At the global level, regional level, in terms of regional political blocks, have always been doing, may actually miss. It's a blind spot on that. So I think whatever is discussed or planned out at a global level needs to be laid out at a local level so that it can be adapted to the different contexts and capabilities, as well as resourcefulness of whatever region or city that you might be working in there. Which brings me to a comment, picking up from what Philip raised earlier about multi-level governance and collectives. Again, it's somewhat a similar situation. This is something that is being fleshed out in IPCC that if we're going to make progress aggressively, then there has to be collective decision making and multi-level governance will deliver that. The thing is that underneath that, there are a lot of other nuanced processes that go on that are really, really very challenging to deal with. For example, the issue of materiality and value that is usually accompanied by appropriation from the power. And you can have a multi-level governance system, but as long as one element within that system, actors, a set of actors, can appropriate a valuable resource, a valuable process, a valuable tool or technology, then it becomes very difficult to achieve the outcome. A very small, quick example, we know that cities are largely centralized and in a traditional planning sense in terms of sanitation and sewage. But when a medium enterprise and innovative business emerges that actually, empties, facilities or toilets and then goes and relates with the centralized system to deposit, and then the power, the different actors with a lot of power realize that there is an opportunity which could possibly be appropriated, then it becomes a political discussion and it becomes a contestation in many ways. So these are things that are not really clear when we come up with frameworks that are at global level, unless if they are adapted at the local level. And lastly, before I can give back the floor to you, is the comment about, again, the specificity of climate change. What we're talking about is that the conditions that are actually life-threatening, even when all our life systems and food are embedded within climate as we know it as normal, but when there is a change in those conditions, and it becomes life-threatening to us, to humanity and the planet, that is what we have to deal with. And it is uncertain, as Barbara mentioned, and we have to really scan the uncertainties in order to build and plan collaboratively the resilient cities. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for these insights. Thank you very much. I think we are approaching the end, possibly, and of the session. And maybe, Barbara, thank you. I mean, I think that was really insightful. Anyone would like to add a couple of words in the end before we wrap up?
Well, I might take that opportunity just because then I'll close the session. Yeah. I think because of the uncertainty and because of the risk that we're dealing with, the process of decision-making becomes really important, and embedding the climate change science, Philip, into every decision-making process of every day is possibly one of the most powerful things we could be doing, because it will then respect what the local cultural circumstances are. Making these decisions, in my part of the world, assuming there's even a land title system in parts of Indonesia and Malaysia and other countries nearby, is a very false assumption, because it's very tribal and the land's coming through families. So there's some really fundamental things that have to be understood and respected. But if the science is embedded into all these decisions, then it can be adapted appropriately locally. That's just a comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, sorry, you'd want to add something, Lindsay?
I was just going to finish, if you like. I think that was my job. Yeah. Is that right? But
yes,
is that okay?
Yeah.
So just to summarize, we will send in a summary report of this session that maybe Rudena and I can write, just the key points to have it on the record. But clearly there were some very key words coming through, wasn't there? There's collaboration, multi-level governance, cultural issues, behavior, innovation, and systems that enable that to happen, I think came through strongly. Time was mentioned in different contexts, actually, but also no time, the urgency. I think that's the challenge with our real systems, isn't it? That how do we get these decisions being made so quickly in this critical decade, as it's described? And I think the different regions around the world I'll just say again, I mean, some of us live in very large countries, Africa, Australia. It's distance matters. And so we have to think quite differently, really, in how we engage communities over a vast land. And so smart technology is also incredibly important. I just reviewed a paper for Nature. I can't talk about it, but it's all about autonomous robotics, smart technology, and the pluses and the minuses. But there are a lot of pluses, I have to say. I think that's probably all. And these small scale case studies like Julio's, I think are incredibly informative, really informative. I'm looking at them everywhere at the moment, and so much to be learnt and documented. That's what I really like to see. So really pleased to see that happening. We'll have to see it a lot more. And platforms, finally, to bring us all together. And that's what the nature of this conference is about. Connecting the IPCC, connecting the mayors, and connecting UN Habitat, of course, the developing nations. So that's fantastic to see in itself. So let me just finish by thanking you all for participating. Thank you to Rudana, who did 99% of the work. So she did a fantastic job in bringing it all together and keeping me in check, which is always a good thing to do. And fantastic to have engagement from across the globe. So, and I think we had someone from Saudi Arabia very briefly, but he seems to have gone.
Just I wanted to add one thing in the conclusion, in the round that in the wrap up, that I would like as well to advocate for allowing creative processes to unfold, building on new behavior, institutional and everyday and business behavior. So as supportive to our planning and not, So I think that's really important.
I agree. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you really everyone for attending and for attending so early in the morning according to European times. And I don't know, it's suitable time for Barbara, so you are lucky. And yeah, so that's really good.
It is. It's a refreshing change for me, so it's nice. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Very nice to meet you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.